The Athletic.
With 2 laps of the German Grand Prix to go, the MotoGP title battle looked like it was heading a little bit back in Jorge Martin's direction after a very, very strong Sachsenring weekend when he seemed to stem the losses that he'd had to Pecco Bagnaia in recent weeks. And then, big cloud of gravel. We've seen this one before, haven't we? Everything swung back in Bagnaia's direction. This is the Race MotoGP Podcast. I'm Matt Beer. With me are Simon Patterson and Valentin Khorounzhiy, who are both in the paddock at the Sachsenring this weekend. A rare chance for them to be in the same place, hang out in the same van. So that was novel, at least. But the sight of Martin chucking away a race lead, that was a bit nostalgic, really. Who wants to go first on... I think first, before we look at the ramifications, why and how did this happen? It wasn't like Bagnaia was massively hassling him at that point, was it? Simon?
There was a bit of pressure coming, I think. Bagnaia had admitted the day before that he'd lost the sprint race because he'd been too conservative with his tyre management and said that he'd played the perfect strategy, but for Sunday's race, not for Saturday's race. He was playing the same strategy again. He had the whole thing completely under control. When you watch the split, he was just taking a 10th here, a 10th there. He was closing it down. He was going to be in a position for, at the very least, another one of those epic last lap showdowns like we saw the year before at the Sachsenring. But I think Martin would have been getting the signals. He would have been seeing that gap was plummeting. He didn't have the tyre left that maybe Bagnaia did, and he asked for too much and went down.
I feel like Jorge Martin is much more likely to crash under that sort of slight shadow pressure than he is when he's actually in a proper dice. I feel like if Bagnaia had been on his tail and he'd been able to hear the engine and see him in his, like, out of the corner of his eye and that kind of thing, it'd almost be so focused on the battle it would be okay. But that sort of, there's a ghost behind you somewhere who may or may not be getting close. That does seem to mess with his head a little bit.
It almost feels like he overthinks these things. Because whenever he's in a scrap, like you say, he 9 times out of 10, he's the guy you put your money on. But part of that is because maybe he doesn't have the time to think about what he's doing or to think about the pressure that he's under. He just gets the job done. And that wasn't the case on Sunday. It hasn't been the case plenty of other times in the past, unfortunately, for him. And honestly, the most important thing I think about sort of post-race from our chat with him was that he's kind of admitted for the first time now that this is a thing that he does. In the past, he's always been quite bullish about it, like Jorge Martin tends to be with absolutely everything. Let's not, he's always bullish. That's just who he is. But he kind of conceded that this is a thing, this is something that I do, and said that he needs to go away over the summer break and figure out if it's something from the way he sets up the bike or something the way he rides the bike, or... I think most importantly, there's something in his own head, which he kind of conceded that he also needs to examine as well and see if that's that's where it's coming from. We've talked a lot this year about how Jorge Martin is learning and adapting. And I think the fact that he's at least conceding that this is something he needs to address, maybe for the first time, despite the large number of times we've seen him do similar, is, it's further proof that learning process, it is a thing, it is happening still.
I don't think this will change anything. Can't imagine for a second that it'll make the slightest bit of difference, except for maybe if he's in a similar situation going forward. Jorge Martin might just decide to settle for second or allow Bagnaia to come up. But I don't think it's not a mental loss of concentration or anything like that. I don't really see how this is something you can work on. Bagnaia pushed him and he cracked. He set himself a target of, I think, basically that 6/10 gap every time in that second phase of the race that Bagnaia got to around those 6/10. You'd see Martin respond immediately and do everything he could to keep it around 6-7, never less than that. And that final push, that final little bit of a push that Bagnaia did, and maybe this last ditch desperate attempt to still not settle for second and still to maybe try to get Martin to crack. And Martin cracked because they ran an insanely fast race. I can't even blame him too much for it, because at this point he needs the points. Obviously, it would have been better to finish second or whatever, or to actually have the duel with Bagnaia than to crash. Obviously, losing 25 is much worse than losing 5, and it's not worth the risk of gaining 5, if that makes any sense. But after a weekend like Mugello, after a weekend like Assen, you could see why it did not compute in Martin's brain to let Bagnaia get close. Like, he clearly felt he needed this double. I don't know how do you fix that longer term, or how that's something that you fix longer term. It's also MotoGP riders crash. They were going really fast in that race. So it wasn't a total shock that one of them went down, because the pace was pretty monstrous.
You see, I think you've hit the nail on the head, Val. I think you have found the solution to the problem, and it's finishing second. That would have been the strategy there, and it's something that we've seen Bagnaia do, where he's like willing to take decent results. You could argue that he did it on Saturday whenever he realised that he'd kind of screwed the strategy in the sprint. He could have pushed a little bit harder. He could have tried for Oliveira. Martin similarly could have eased it off a little bit. He could have at least let Bagnaia catch him, and then seen how it played out whenever they were on track together, knowing that he probably had the advantage in a dogfight at the Sachsenring, because we saw that last year. I think there are other strategies he could have played there, more sensible ones, instead of just focusing on maintaining that gap. Because the other thing is he's bound to have had pit signals that told him that behind Bagnaia there was a huge gap.
Yeah.
There was a big block of time to Alex Marquez. It wasn't like he was going to ease off a little bit and suddenly find himself fifth, like in Phillip Island last year. He knew that he had a bit of buffer there, and I think he played it wrong.
I think mentally it's really complicated in a title battle like this, because you lose at Mugello, yeah, fine. Bagnaia is awesome at Mugello. You lose at Assen, fine. Bagnaia is clearly amazing at Assen. You ran him close both times, but you didn't get any points off of him. If you also lose at tracks that aren't necessarily Bagnaia definite 37-pointer tracks, then just you are in trouble. And I know that's all exists in the realm of theory, because in the realm of reality, he lost 20 points, which is much worse than any sort of perception of just consecutive streak of Bagnaia defeats. It's points that he will need come Valencia. I'm sure of it. But it's also not a title battle increasingly, where because Bagnaia seems to have sorted himself out, and because the 2024 Ducati seems to have taken a leap in how it uses the tire and everything it does, it's one where accepting defeat, I can see how that's difficult, or even accepting the risk of defeat at a track like this. I can't say I'm massively disappointed about him again with what he did, because I understand how it happened. Well, not the dynamics of it, but again, neither does he. It seems so in the same boat there.
You talk about the difference between perception and points, though, and that feeds in nicely to the first of our questions from the Race Members Club. Daniel Ingleton says, just how big a moment in this year's championship was Jorge Martin's crash on his own? Now, like you say, Val, it is literally that many points, but it's a psychological thing. It's a bigger deal here. Now, we have still got probably over half the season to go, depending on how many races actually turn up in the second half of the year. There's the narrative really needn't have been set yet. This time last year, it certainly wasn't. This time for the last couple of years, really, it hasn't been. The championship has changed a lot in the second half. But, like you say, there was a run of defeats. There was a chance to stop that run of defeats. There was the idea of Martin getting over this habit of sometimes crashing out of the lead would have been quite important. And the fact he's admitted this might be something I just do sometimes, that's a hell of a psychological gift to hand to Bagnaia, just going, oh yeah, you know what you've got in your armoury, like amazing first laps and stuff. I've got this great qualifying pace, but yeah, sometimes I might just hand you 25 points with 2 laps to go, because that's just part of my vibe.
But that's part of the other guy's vibe too.
Well, less so now, it seems. It definitely used to be.
I don't know. I'm not sure I believe that. I'm not entirely, the sample size for me isn't large enough to conclusively feel that way.
I think the champions, I think this decided the title. I know that's a bold statement to make with at the halfway point. It is. But based on what we've seen in the last 2 rounds, the Bagnaia domination whenever he's feeling good, then this combined with the fact that yes, satellite bikes don't win championships, but do you know who definitely don't win championships? Satellite bikes are the rider who's going to a different factory next year and whose manufacturer is leaving them. There is no, Jorge Martin is on the bike that he is going to finish the season on. Pecco Bagnaia isn't. And I think all of the momentum, all of the support from the factory, just everything is going to roll in Bagnaia's favour now. He goes into the summer break completely, in control of everything again. He's going to come back from the summer break, hopefully a very happy married man, because his wedding's in a few weeks' time. He's going to go into the second half of the season knowing that his future is absolutely secure with a team that will do everything to support him. And Martin will be, I think, increasingly thinking that there's got to be a part of him that thinks he's going to go to Aprilia next year and it's not going to be this easy to fight for titles, right? So there's going to be an element of urgency around, do I need to win this title this year? And I think the more that we see Jorge Martin in that mindset, the more that we're going to see him crashing out, doing silly things, not being as fast as Bagnaia. I'm being slightly, there's a little bit of hyperbole whenever I say that this is the moment that decides the title, but I think this is indicative of the last 3 rounds that have decided the title, and I just see it all rolling one way from here on.
So my objection to that is just that all those things that you said were true all weekend as well. Going into this event, everything around the loss of Ducati status and how that play into his mind, how that play into parts and stuff. I know development hasn't really kicked on much since that decision was made, but still, all those things were true. And he still banged it on pole again, several places ahead of Bagnaia. He still came back at Bagnaia when he needed to in both races. The only thing he didn't do was not shunt pointlessly out of the lead with 2 laps to go, which is obviously a big deal, but everything else was fine. It was just that. If he could, and okay, he said he's going to go away and learn how to avoid that, work out why this happens. He might not be able to. This might still be a Martin thing. But a lot of things went very right, despite all the reasons he should now be being beaten every weekend.
But I still think that if he'd not crashed on Sunday, if he'd finished second behind Bagnaia, taking the smarter play, finished second behind Bagnaia, I'd still be saying right now that Bagnaia was my clear favourite for the title. So I think all of that plus minus 20 points just makes me more certain than I've ever been. It just, I only see this going one way now.
I genuinely don't think the spec will come into it because I don't think Ducati will even need to do that in any meaningful way. And again, I'm of the belief that Ducati, within reason, will try to do everything to be seen as giving Jorge Martin and Pramac the best chance possible. For me, the only thing that matters is that when the summer break is over, we go to Silverstone, which I think is another 37 for Bagnaia.
I should stress, I don't think that Ducati are going to hamstring Pramac. I don't think that's what's going to happen. I don't think that the bike is suddenly going to get slower. I just think that, we've seen every year that the Ducati gets faster as the season progresses because new stuff arrives.
Yeah.
And there won't be any new stuff going to Pramac.
I think there will be. Genuinely, I don't see why there wouldn't be.
It would be the exact opposite of how every other factory has worked forever, basically.
Ducati is the exact opposite of how every factory... Ducati is also in a position of being the exact opposite to every factory.
But they can't have a number 1 plate in Aprilia.
No, it's not even that for me. The big difference now is Pramac's off to Yamaha. Yamaha's nicked a bunch of Ducati people already.
They don't care what Pramac thinks. They don't care what Jorge Martin thinks. They care what Pramac and Jorge Martin will say publicly.
No, they don't.
Because publicly, Ducati is... I'm certain they do.
Publicly,
Ducati is desperate to be seen as giving its armada of bikes the only bikes fighting for anything in MotoGP.
Ducati's not going to notice what anyone else is saying over the winter. All the chat is going to be about that.
I disagree. I think there is, as proven in recent years... I think there is maybe not an obsession, but certainly a priority to be seen as winning these titles fair and square. Also, when your bikes are the ones finishing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 every weekend.
Yes, but in that era, it hasn't mattered. It hasn't genuinely threatened to cost Ducati a title so far, or
really in the Fabio Quartararo title fight of 2022. It didn't matter.
Go on.
They still that year they still did the whole fair play, and then it came down to the crunch and it was like, oh, you know what, team orders.
Not team orders that you would do in that situation.
Mapping it. They have
Wasn't
absolutely
mapping it a Gresini joke?
But it was something that they used to help Dovi win.
No. Yeah, but I'm talking about 2022 specifically in Pecco Bagnaia. No, the Dovi situation was very different because it was a different Ducati. It was a Ducati that I think,
but it's the same people in charge.
But it was,
last year,
it was a different
Bastianini
Ducati.
last year was there was talk of team orders all the way through the end of last season, and there was hints that they'd been used, even if they weren't, even if people weren't told to use them, it was implied that it would be in their best interests to do it. And it happened. And I think at the end of the day, the purpose of this factory is for Ducati to win titles. And if they have to choose between the Ducati that is still going to be a Ducati next year or the Ducati that's going to be an Aprilia Yamaha next year, there is no question. They cannot give a Yamaha satellite teamer and a factory Aprilia rider the chance to spend next year as the world champion.
And to me, they cannot give Yamaha even more ways to learn stuff about what Ducati's doing well by giving Pramac a bunch of bits that leads towards 2025. Because surely, second half of the season, next year's bits would start turning up at Pramac to get a little bit of trying out.
They generally do, yeah.
But I don't think the stuff that gets introduced in season is that kind of like top secret development.
Some of it is. The ride height device was. The ride height device went to Jack Miller at the end of the year before we all realised it was even there, remember? When he was still a Pramac rider? There is times and there are things.
No, that's possible. And ultimately, if they can point to this as like proprietary information for 2025, then obviously you don't give that to Pramac. Oh, it also depends, I guess, on what engineers you keep, whatever, etc. Because there's going to be a whole shebang over that.
I just feel like there'd be fewer conversations happening within earshot of Pramac.
Yeah,
and that sort of thing as well.
There's a difference between, and Simon is absolutely right that I think just generally the way things are done will disadvantage Pramac. I just don't think it's going to be an edict.
No.
I think Ducati will try to straddle that line where you give them as much of a chance as you can while still, tipping the scales in favor of Bagnaia, who should win anyway, who they think will win anyway, I think.
The other thing is, right, even if, I don't think there's going to be an edict. I don't think they're going to decide, right, we're not supporting them anymore. But I think that they will make a decision that certain information and certain things don't go their way, certain parts. But I also think just human nature means that it's unlikely that Pramac are going to get the full support. I mean, we've already essentially heard Jorge Martin saying that he feels like, the kind of implied that the Pramac engineers or the Ducati engineers weren't as welcome in the Pramac box as they had been before all this was announced, that things were uncomfortable whenever Gigi came into his garage now. So if even the Pramac side are putting out, sort of subconscious signals saying, we don't really want you around anymore, it's just going to be, it's going to be a matter of course that whenever it comes to the end of a session and Gigi and his engineering team have to go and see someone and Jorge Martin is giving out, signs that he doesn't really want them around or whatever, they're going to go to the Gresini box first or the VR46 box first. And, Martin is going to be the bottom of the pecking order for their time and their sort of, their like intellectual resource. And we're just going to see, I think, a tapering in terms of that bike's performance.
I would say, though, on that front, if Martin and Pramac are about to lose a championship to Bagnaia and Ducati, it's kind of in their interest to give the impression that there's a bit of a fracture there.
Yeah, that's the other thing.
I think that helps the narrative if they can go, oh, look, it's not going so well with Ducati anymore.
Yeah, I think the problem for Ducati is that it makes sense for Pramac and Jorge to say,
of course, they're bastards.
The support is diminished.
And they might not even use it as an excuse, because if there's one thing we've kind of traditionally seen, it's that Jorge Martin tends to have a bit of a chip on his shoulder sometimes. And I think his perception of it will make him be vocal about it, even if it's not necessarily the case. And I think that is something that then in turn fractures the relationship even more.
Yeah.
If Ducati feel like they're not supporting him any differently and he's out telling everyone that blah, 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 then you've less reason to want to go there, and it all feeds into itself and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Can I just throw in one more Pramac thing before we move on to our third title contender, who seems less and less like a title contender? Dan Neal from the Race Members Club asked if there had been a worse lap for Pramac this year, because at the same time Martin was crashing, Frankie Morbidelli was being passed by Enea Bastianini. Now, Dan, I'm going to use that actually, not to answer your question directly, but I do want to spend 2 minutes talking about Franco Morbidelli, because there he was at the front for the first time since that random bit of damp Argentina-ness on the Yamaha. I think it was the last time we saw Frankie looking that competitive. And the key thing for me there was that for those few laps where he was at the front, he looked like he could be pretty useful to Martin's title fight. And it looked like Pramac might actually have two riders in the game. Then, obviously, he went backwards. But that was it. That to me, I was pleased to see Frankie back near the front, because I think we're all really fond of Frankie as a character as well, and he's had some very tough times, not all of his own making. But yeah, Simon, what's your take on Morbidelli's fleeting return to the front and potential usefulness?
I think Val and I were sitting next to each other discussing whether or not Frankie Morbidelli was a Pramac Ducati rider or a VR46 Academy rider.
Yeah, tricky one.
Because obviously, and the reality is that actually for one brief moment, it looked like he was very much a Pramac rider whenever he made that overtake on Bagnaia to demote him to third. But then suddenly he was, right on the tail of Martin and thinking about leading the race, which would actually have favoured Bagnaia again, which I think, if anything, proves that Franco Morbidelli is racing for Franco Morbidelli at the minute.
Yeah, exactly.
And that it's all about getting himself back into the form that, that he should be in, that he feels like he should be in. He complained all weekend about... his big issue is still that there's like a drop that comes in his performance a bit into the race that the others don't have, and I think we saw that perfectly on Sunday, because it came sort of all of a sudden. He just wasn't quite at the podium pace. He was top 6 pace. But to answer Dan's question, I don't think that any part of that race was a disaster for Franco Morbidelli. I think it's exactly what he expected from it, given that he knew that drop was coming. And even if he did end up behind an Bastianini, yes, it's not really a big deal for him. It's still another good result to build off, especially going into the summer break. Yeah,
no, for sure. I don't think there'll be any disappointment in there. Neither is there like this big shock, because ultimately it is a GP24. So this is where it belongs, in the hands of any rider who's at least pretty good. And we know that Franco Morbidelli is at least pretty good, even in his post knee injury travails. We know he's very capable on his best weekends, and this was a good weekend. He's eradicating the knowledge gap that existed in his extremely compromised preseason, which, remember, was going to be effectively his first meaningful time on the Ducati, excluding the Valencia postseason test, which is of limited use sometimes for that kind of thing. I mean, it's always important to have the proof of concept, right? Because you can say, oh, I'm learning, I'm catching up. But sometimes riders say that and it never comes. It does seem to be coming for Franco Morbidelli, which is good. It's good for his MotoGP perspectives. Probably won't be enough for a factory contract and a factory spec bike next year, but we'll get to all that.
Anyone remember when this felt like it might be a 3-rider title fight, not a 2-rider one? This was supposed to be, we predicted it last week, the weekend that Marc Marquez finally got that first Ducati win, which feels more and more elusive. He is now drifting further away from the championship lead with the form Bagnaya's on. So Marc Marquez's weekend was, in the end, in results terms, not terrible, but we've got so many questions from the Race Members Club along these sort of lines. Here's Thomas Knight saying, how would Mark's weekend have played out if it wasn't for Stefan Bradl's savage block in qualifying? John Ip says, would Marquez have won the race if it got past Q1? TV Room Raccoon says, if Marquez hadn't crashed on Friday, would he have won in a dominant manner, or would he have been fighting with Pecco and Martin? Basically, a lot of things went wrong for Marc Marquez, and he still came through the field how he did. What did we miss out on this weekend, Simon?
The Friday crash triggered everything and probably ended his chance of a pretty comfortable win. I'm quite sure of that. Big crash on Friday, broke a finger, which he wasn't too upset about. Bruised his ribs really badly, which he was quite upset about because it meant breathing was difficult. Ended up leaving him kind of stuck in Q1. Stefan Bradl was a complete and utter idiot who was just flopping about on the racing line at cruising speed and should have been probably sent home for it, not sent to the back of the grid for it. Marquez probably lost a Q2 spot at that point that would have moved him up to front couple of rows, he would have made a start that would have put him in the Martin Bagnaia group, I think, at that point, and would probably have just eased away from them through the race. He looked, relatively comfortably to have that kind of pace early on in the weekend, even if we didn't get to see too much of it before the crash. The way that he did ride through, especially in the final couple of laps of the race into second, was pretty impressive. And yeah, I think we were probably denied another chance to see him win this year. It's really starting to feel like the one thing that's missing from this package right now is luck, because it's just, he seems to get massively punished for the smallest mistakes whenever you see others get away with quite big ones. But I think it's another weekend where he'll leave unhappy, but it's still slightly content. It's another weekend where you think there has to be a Gresini winner to come in at some point this year, even if he hasn't had them at the two circuits that we all expected them to come at in Coda and Sachsenring. He's going to be under a ton of pressure now that Aragon's back in the calendar to do something when we get there, because that's the next one that kind of stands out as a Marquez hopeful. But yeah, I think all in all, a good weekend for him, if not the one that he wanted.
Well, it's interesting you say the only thing missing is luck, because I think Moto Bell from the Race Members Club will disagree. There's a particularly, will I call this savage? It's pretty full on. I'm going to read it out. Is this Marc Marquez's worst season so far? Asks Moto Bell. He has not delivered on the potential and he's missed too many opportunities. Too much self-inflicted pain, some by the team, mostly by him. He should be much closer to the Bagnaia in the championship had he had an average Marc Marquez season just based on the bike's potential and his, what Moto Bell calls, now non-peak capability. Missed opportunities at Portimao where they couldn't solve it being dramatically slow in the final sector. Le Mans he should have won. Catalonia he could have been a factor. And here at Sachsenring, just doing a solo lap by himself, should have seen him through to Q2 and with a chance to win. So Moto Bell suggesting that actually Marquez has brought most of this on himself. What do you reckon? I
mean, in terms of physical pain, nothing will ever compare to last year. I think even after the 2020 season and the broken arm and that needed to be rebroken and twisted and all that, I think 2023 is probably going to be the season where he most spiked shares in painkillers, especially after the Sachsenring. I think that in terms of the bike's potential, I think he's overriding the bike's potential. I mean, look at what everyone else on a GP23 is doing. Look at the ease with which he just blew his brother out of the way at the end of the race on the same machine. The GP23 is not the bike. The Marc Marquez GP23 is not the bike that Pecco Bagnaia won the championship on. It's a much more basic version of that. And it is no way superior or even close to this GP24 that might be the greatest racing motorcycle that's ever been built, according to the people that look at the data from it. I think he's riding above the potential of the bike, and I think he's been unlucky, but he hasn't. This is nowhere near close to peak Marc Marquez unluckiness.
Yeah, I think his worst season was 23. Also in terms of performance, 23 was actually, I was getting frustrated at points in 23 by just the general approach to the season. I think I'm on record as feeling that he didn't start it quite in the right way, and then everything obviously went very badly as the Honda declined and Marquez and Honda no longer made any sense together. This year, I mean, I don't like luck. Like I don't like that as the explanation, because he's the one crashing in places where other riders crash. And of course, again, I'm very forgiving of the Jorge Martin crash, so I'm also very forgiving of the Marc Marquez crash. It's clearly very easy to crash these bikes, especially at the Sachsenring, especially when the front tire goes cold, because it doesn't get used on the right side for 80% of the lap. But it's not total luck. It's also probably a byproduct of, you say average Marc Marquez season, right? But in this case, average Marc Marquez season would be, you have to take the good with the bad, right? If he goes truly average, then those other points that he's picked up aren't there on the table. All those charges from like 13th on the grid to 2nd to 3rd, they aren't on the table if he goes about it the usual way the usual way riders go about it. Clearly, you take the edge with the risk. So for me, I don't know that he would have dominated this weekend. I think I like his chances of winning, but the problem is with the GP24, it doesn't start weekends as strongly as it finishes them. So I don't know if he would have arrived at his ceiling of performance at the Sachsenring before they did. On Friday, every time he ran, he was the fastest. But I don't know that would have meant on Sunday he would have definitely been the fastest. Then again, he started 13th. He eased through the pack at a track where you can't really overtake that well. So I think his chances would have been, like, at the very least, I think it would have had a three-way fight for supremacy there. But, again, is this the worst Marc Marquez season? No, I don't see it. Because to take away those mistakes, you also probably have to take away what makes him the quickest GP23 rider by a lot on most of the weekends.
Let's remember that this weekend last year, he crashed 5 times, smashed himself so badly that he didn't get to race. And, the image of the end of Marc Marquez at Repsol Honda is that video of him gesticulating to the onboard camera and the bike, telling him what he thinks of it. That all happened here last year. I think, comparing that to finishing second this weekend isn't a comparison, really, is it?
But I think where Motobell's coming from is this his worst season when he's had an okay bike? Because, yes, I agree.
Yeah, 15 maybe.
But I agree that the last few Honda seasons, he did some genuinely rubbish things there. There were times when he chose to just not ride very fast. There were times when he chose just to throw his head at the floor repeatedly, and he had control over those two situations, and he was trying to make a point, basically. I understand why he was trying to make that point because of everything he'd been through physically with the team. There were self-inflicted things in there, but it was all in this kind of prism of 2020 onwards, Marc Marquez. I just think this year might be a little bit as well. He's still trying to get back to the front properly, and I think that's feeding into the errors.
But I don't think you can say, 2023 doesn't count because the bike was really rubbish, and then simultaneously say 2024 is the one that's worst because the bike is better. You can't blame the bike when it's bad and then take away all the credit from the bike when it's good either. I think that, we're talking about seasons, so we're talking about the combined package, which is bike, team, rider. And as a combination, I think 2023 has to be just the worst ever.
Should we do a Larry prediction? Because we haven't done one of those in a while. How many races, and I'm going to say Grand Prix, not count sprints for this purpose, because let's just do Grand Prix wins. How many Grand Prix will Marc Marquez win in 2024? Simon?
3.
Val?
Like 1, but I don't know where.
It pains me. I'm going to say none, and I don't like to say that because I want the romance of this story so much, but I feel like we would have got there by now.
There's going to be somewhere, especially in the overseas races, there's going to be somewhere where it rains. And old Marc Marquez is going to come to play. Like it's going to hammer down in Motegi or in Buriram or Phillip Island, and he's just going to be like, what the hell is this? It's going to be like a flag-to-flag race where he dominates everyone by pitting early and just, you know what I mean? There'll be one race at least where he just shines. There'll be one race, I think, where there'll be like an Aragon where everything clicks that weekend and he has no bad luck and he just disappears off into the distance. And there's going to be a race where he ends up in a Le Mans style scrap and just barges his way through into the lead. For me,
the most likely Marc win is Jorge and Pecco collide 2 seconds up the road.
That's also entirely possible.
Yeah.
Yeah. That was where I nearly bet 1 or 2, but I want to see it. I really want to see it. I'm going to be unashamedly biased. I love this storyline of the fallen great coming back too much. The biggest. So for years and years and years, I've never worried about getting spoilers about races if I'm not working. I'm like, well, this is my job. I need to know what's going on. I'll check the results straight away if I'm not working. This weekend, I didn't see the race live. We're doing things for my daughter's birthday through the weekend. And I was so careful to avoid every possible spoiler for qualifying for both races and watch them all in full as soon as there was a chance, purely because it was a Sachsenring and it was Marc Marquez, and I knew how Friday had gone, and the storyline was so strong for me. So I did get the full surprise of Martin crashing while watching it while washing up on Sunday night, rather than like seeing it with you two talking about it on Slack at least. Well, that you wouldn't need to because you're in the same place this weekend. But yeah, I want it to happen for storyline purposes, and for I think Gresini deserves it as well. And Mark too, of course. But yeah, all these misses are just starting to get in my head a little bit. How did you react when you were sat next to each other and Jorge Martin?
We did the Lorenzo Rossi wall between us in the media center.
Okay.
So we still spoke on Slack. I don't know. I mean, I'm trying to remember now, but it was like, if I sounded a bit zen about it at the start of the episode, I think I just was. I genuinely was like, oh well, that just happens. Shrug. So trying to think what elicited the most emotion this weekend in terms of
for me, obviously, like watch the Jorge Martin thing did, but actually it was actually Marquez's crash on Friday gave me the biggest like loud noise during the weekend. A little question that's been on my mind through the weekend, actually, and through last weekend too. I haven't looked at the stats on this. This is just a kind of hunch. It feels like the last couple of races have got a bit more brutal. Not with riders colliding, but the crashes have been ferocious. We've had riders injured, and it's felt like we've gone quite a nice long time without riders getting injured. Is that just the nature of these circuits we've been at, and the temperatures causing that possibly?
Yeah, probably. But also just a bit of random chance, I think. We got through the first half of the season, I think, fairly lucky in terms of, the injury rates we've had. And it's sort of, it's reverted to the mean a little bit, which happens when you have a bigger sample size of races. I don't think timing, temperature, probably. And track nature also probably. Obviously, Assen and Sachsenring are clearly quite conducive to unfortunately big ones.
Yeah, fast tracks with chance of cold tires is not a good combo, is it? So through this episode so far, you've heard quite a few little interjections from the Race Members Club, which, as we've banged on about enthusiastically for quite a few episodes now includes MotoGP content. You can sign up through the race website, the-race.com/members-club, or you can sign up through Patreon, which is where you get the chance to ask questions to appear on this podcast. There's a riders only tier on Patreon as well if you just want the MotoGP stuff that we do. It's well worth checking out the extras that you get through the Members Club, MotoGP wise, at least 2 extra podcasts a month. I think right now we've got ideas for 3 for July, so we'll get back to those and see when we can put them together for you. And ad-free versions of this podcast, chance to throw your questions in as well. And just generally, we're on quite a good run where if you suggest something in the Members Club, we've got we'll do our best to make it happen, basically. So back to the list of questions from this race. Sean H. Less of a question, more a statement, and one that I was also making while catching up on the races. Trackhouse? Where were they? This is surely a one-off, right? So Trackhouse, both Miguel Oliveira and Raul Fernandez in qualifying, and then Oliveira in the races, particularly the sprint as well, looking very, very quick. Where did that come from? Why hasn't it been the case anywhere so far? Why will it be the case again? Simon?
So I don't think Raul Fernandez did anything unexpected at the weekend. I think this is kind of the trajectory that he's been on for quite a while, where things have been improving, where he's been pretty good in qualifying. He's been all right in races. I think, he basically had another weekend about the level that I expected from him at the minute. Miguel Oliveira had a spectacular weekend. He hasn't looked like that in a long, long time, and it was great to see it. He attributes it pretty much all to being given Aleix Espargaro's engineers whenever Aleix wasn't able to race, and all the extra attention from Aprilia, which someone else would use as evidence to support the fact that satellite teams don't win titles even when they have factory bikes. But I wouldn't do that. I do you know what? Part of me thinks that yes, he absolutely benefited from having the extra support from the Aprilia engineers. And another part of me thinks that he benefited from thinking he had the extra support from the Aprilia engineers, and that there was a little bit of a psychological confidence boost that came from being, feeling a bit more factory at the weekend and delivering on it, combined with the fact that this was a really, really good circuit for Aprilia this year, it seemed. And, we should have seen both Maverick Viñales and Aleix at the sharp end too. Aleix was unable to race, so we weren't able to see anything from him. And then Maverick just had a spectacularly Maverick weekend where it was so good and then it wasn't, because that's what Captain Inconsistency does.
Yeah, for me, it's the Trackhouse situation is primarily the circuit, which is not to take anything away from the riders, and especially from Miguel. Miguel performed at the upper band of how he has looked relative to the works Aprilias, because we've absolutely had already rounds this year where Oliveira has been, mixing with the works Aprilias, or even maybe better on some Sundays. And just here it came at a track where the 2024 RSGP was, I think, a fair bit better than the 2023. I mean, I've spent much of the weekend sort of asking riders about it, asking Massimo Rivola about it, which you'll hear at some point, whether there are tracks where the 23 was better than the 24 and just how they generally compare. And the gist of the impression is that the 24 is more rounded, which means you'll see the 23 maybe shine more at a place like Assen, which is traditional Aprilia stronghold as of late. Maybe, a place like Barcelona. I think also a place like Silverstone, I would expect. A place like Termas de Rio Hondo, if it was on the calendar. But in terms of the other tracks, sort of the new bike has raised the floor a little bit. And at the Sachsenring, it looked to have raised the floor so much to where it like properly made it a contender. And it worked for Oliveira this weekend. It also did work for Viñales until, he flung himself off and spent the rest of the weekend. If you hear him say it, actually, his Sunday pace wasn't necessarily constrained by the fact he flung himself off. I don't know. I mean, that's tough for me to really say. But in any case, he will have been definitely constrained by the grid position, which is also a classic Maverick thing. Miguel was very strong in the sprint, in a very hot sprint. It was the hottest day of the weekend by a considerable margin. And then in the cooler, longer race, we could clearly see that the Aprilia here didn't quite have it with the Ducatis, but it was still, I think that the baseline of the bike was still really, really quite strong here. And for me, that's the main thing, which is, again, not to diminish the achievements of Oliveira, who you will remember if you listen to this podcast. I'm fairly consistently of the opinion that he can do really, really good things on the Aprilia, and so is Aprilia. Again, you'll hear the Rivola chat later, but Rivola is the first to bring up the Valencia test, the initial first impression, and how well Miguel gelled with that bike back then.
Yeah, I would say you're consistent on this podcast of reminding the world what Oliveira is capable of. I'm consistent just going, what? When it comes to Oliveira. But I must say, at the weekend, particularly in the sprint, I was like, this is why I get frustrated with Oliveira, because when he's at his best, he's very, very good. I genuinely think he's excellent. And then there's a lot of other races that are less like that. And I think his explanations don't always hold water either.
But do you think there have been races this season where Oliveira was just as good, but the bike wasn't quite there? I think that's entirely possible. I mean,
possibly, yeah. I think it skewed it this weekend as well. Like, if I missed having the benchmark of having Aleix Espargaro there and having Viñales. Like, that was a horrible crash Viñales had. Regardless of what he said, that did put him down the grid, and ouch. Yeah, that looked like an injury. It was the way he landed. I was like, okay, I don't think you've broken any limbs with that, but that is a painful place to come down.
That's what he said. Back pain throughout after it.
Speaking of, I should say, speaking of riders who have high peaks, Tony L says, what's happening with Pedro Acosta? Do you think he just needs a couple of finishes to get his season back on track? It looks like he's just trying a bit too hard. Thomas Knights then jumped in on this question and said, it says a lot that Acosta is maybe below par, yet still light years ahead of Jack Miller, to which Tony replied, different expectations, which again says a lot, I would say. Now, I noticed, just before we started recording, Simon filed his rider rankings the weekend. I noticed Pedro Acosta was quite high up, which is possibly the first time this weekend I noticed Pedro Acosta. So what was going on with Pedro Acosta this weekend?
I mean, Pedro Acosta's a rookie who still has some really good weekends and some really bad weekends, and still occasionally does some really, really dumb stuff like launch himself off the track into the gravel in the final laps of the sprint and end up in last place. I think that there's a few riders in the grid right now who you can't really look at the results as the full picture of where they're at, and I think he's one of them based on the fact that he is still a rookie, and we all tend to forget that because he's been the most phenomenal rookie since Marc Marquez. He's just, I mean, it just needs more time. It just needs more time. He kind of actually, had a bit of a stealthy Sunday where we weren't really seeing much of him apart from a bit of early argy-bargy with Raul Fernandez that cost him quite a bit of time, but managed to come back into a decent result from that, even if he didn't get a lot of TV time doing it. P7 at the line is pretty good, considering this is a place where it's difficult to get by, and he lost a bit of time early on. I think it's all going according to the sort of Pedro Acosta master plan to basically be a 2025 title contender, not a 2024 race winner.
It's not him, it's the bike.
There's that too.
Yeah, I was about to say he's still top KTM on the grid, top KTM in the Grand Prix as well, just perhaps not by the margins that we had seen early in the season.
Looks like this in Assen has been a pretty bad 1-2 punch for KTM. And there's now fairly consistently a suggestion from Jack Miller that the carbon chassis that they introduced in Misano last season is still awaiting further refinements. That as a proof of concept, it obviously was very successful, but that now they're waiting for that extra step. I even asked him whether he feels KTM has overcorrected from its past habit of just bringing truckloads of stuff to now being maybe overly conservative in development or something like that. He didn't necessarily agree, but he didn't necessarily disagree either. It's just he was just matter of factly, we haven't developed enough. I think you can see that in the results. Acosta ran 14th after the opening lap. He was 7th and ahead of Brad Binder, narrowly ahead, but ahead at the finish. He remains the best RC16 rider. He becomes the best RC16 rider during every weekend. Like maybe on Friday he isn't always, and it takes him some smarts, a clever follow here and there to get himself definitively into Q2. And maybe in the sprint he isn't always, but by the end of the weekend, it feels like he gets there over and over and over again. Overall, it feels like a really frustrated camp, because I think the only rider at Sachsenring who's performed above their season expectation this year so far is Augusto Fernandez, who's coming from much, much further back, and who obviously got the tire pressure penalty. So yeah, fun part of that. It's just, everybody sounds just a bit frustrated, and you can explain that with individual oscillations, and you could suggest that maybe Acosta is pushing too hard, or is making mistakes that he didn't make at the start of the season. I think there's probably something to that. Is the attempt to keep up that level, to make sure because he's already asserted himself as the top KTM, he now has to be the top KTM all the time, and he's clearly a guy who has sky high expectations of himself. But also, KTM has sagged a little bit. I think they'll see it in a big storyline of the second part of the year, whether they make enough progress to set up what I think, and what I think Pedro Acosta thinks, and what I think KTM Mattighofen should think, has to be a proper title bout in 2025.
Sort of related to that, Daniel Ingleton says the top 5 for all Ducatis would have been top 6 but for Martin's crash. Any particular reason why this circuit suited their bike so much? To which my first answer would be, you discount Honda and Yamaha from being the top bike any weekend anyway. KTM was in a little bit of a dip, and Aprilia we couldn't really judge this weekend with Espargaro injured and Vinales battered. So to me, this was a kind of an open goal for Ducati anyway, but is the Sachsenring more suited to Ducati than other places?
I mean, probably a little bit, but I just like to put it in a wider context of the recent season, ever since Ducati seemed to have purged its rear tire vibration issues on the newer bike. And the impression now is just that new carcass rear tire is a rear tire that Ducati now exploits better than anybody else does. I'm cheating a little bit because this excludes the sprints, which for me are also a very valid indicator of performance, and etc., etc. But when was the last time a non-Ducati finished on the Grand Prix podium? The Circuit of the Americas.
Oh, thanks
Since
for
then,
just knowing that.
On Sundays, the best Ducatis have finished 6th, 5th, 4th, 5th, 5th, 6th. That's the season. Yeah, the Sachsenring, seems to be quite good for them. The grip's pretty decent, and bike, didn't used to turn back in the day, clearly turns super well now. But it's being exaggerated, I think, by the fact that the likes of, the KTM wasn't at the races, and the various Aprilia riders all tripped over their shoelaces, or were Miguel Oliveira good, but still maybe not quite at that level to drag an RSGP kicking and screaming, fighting with the Ducatis?
There's a really good point about the turning, because so often you just forget how relatively recently Ducati was a bike where you were like, oh yeah, there's a lot of corners here. Let's not look to Ducati. They need a massive straight to make their advantage work. I feel like the Sachsenring was a bit. You couldn't really tell which bikes were actually good, because Marquez was so good before that. Danny Pedrosa had a great winning run there as well. Ducati went 15 years between Sachsenring wins from Casey Stoner in 2008 to last year. But yeah, everywhere is now a Ducati track, regardless of whether it's got straights, corners, bumps, crests, ditches, whatever. On to a MotoGP returnee. Dan Neal says, how did we think Remy Gardner performed? So Remy Gardner, last seen in MotoGP, hurling verbal grenades at KTM and vice versa after his very unhappy season after winning the Moto2 title. Now with the Yamaha team in Superbikes, but back for this weekend, standing for Alex Rins at Yamaha. And from the outside, slow all weekend, but not any slower than you expect a stand-in rider to be, would be my take. What do you guys reckon?
He did exactly as I expected him to do, pretty much. He was not terribly slow. He didn't throw the bike down the road repeatedly. He didn't have a disaster. He didn't get in anyone's way. He probably gave Yamaha a decent bit of feedback from a different perspective. And yeah, and he got to be a factory MotoGP rider for the weekend. I think it was went pretty well all in all for him.
Yeah, for me, I think over one lap, actually, I would say in my book, he did slightly better than I expected him to do.
Agreed.
Over race pace wasn't there, but it feels like, we once used to think of Fabio Quartararo as this great qualifier, and I'm sure he still is, but it feels like the real damage he does to his teammates these days is all in the race pace. Versus Franco Morbidelli last year, versus Alex Rins this year, and now versus Remy Gardner, who he outpaced by like more than a second lap in the race. Whereas in over qualifying trim, it was considerably less than that. Which again, I think is to Remy's credit, because it's hard to show up and run competitive lap times right away in this category. Clearly, he's having to rewire his brain a little bit from the World Superbike Pirellis to the MotoGP Michelins, and he'd never tried this bike meaningfully before. He seemed to get on okay with it, but he admitted that it is a bit aggressive, like the Yamaha riders say it is. Just nice to see him again. I don't think this was the kind of performance where you just you tear up the Pramac Yamaha plans and you don't sign Sergio Garcia or whatever because Remy Gardner show up and did pretty decent in a wild card. I think you still push on with the plans that you had, but you, at the very least, it should strengthen, I think, his standing within the Yamaha camp overall as a wider thing. And again, just lovely to see him back, as his Grand Prix racing career, after all it was, had ended on such a crummy note with KTM, with just everybody upset, everybody lobbing grenades at each other, scuffles between KTM management and his management, all that stuff, not particularly pleasant. And Remy's the kind of character who is enjoyable to have back. His facial hair made him look like US country superstar Morgan Wallen, which distracted me the entire weekend. Not a big Morgan Wallen fan, much prefer Remy or Zach Bryan, I guess. But that's neither here nor there.
Niche. I'm going to stop that answer there and move on. Grumpy Grizz says, tyre pressures. Why don't they just set a minimum safe tyre pressure? Why all this XPSI for Y laps? Just set the minimum pressure, and if you go below it, you fail. Simon, that one feels like your turf.
Because the ridiculously stupid garbage red head devices that should all be scrapped and thrown off mean the tyre pressures are just... The Michelin can't cope with them, so the tyre pressure is all over the shop at the minute. So we could set a minimum tyre pressure. We could easily say you have to start with X pressure, and then we would get 12 laps into the race and everyone who's following someone else would fall off. Essentially. That is what it comes down to. The pressure, whenever the pressure goes up too much, which the ride height device is forced it to do, if you're following someone and in the heat of another bike, then it's like riding in glass. So you fall off. The only positive thing I have to say about tyre pressures this weekend is that we only have to go another half a season, and then Michelin brings a new tyre that will hopefully fix this once and for all.
Yeah, Augusto Fernandez and Johan Zarco both hit with 16 seconds.
And Stefan Bradl.
And Stefan Bradl, yeah. Which I felt Bradl's weekend was so inconsequential that I even noticed the note next to him.
It's pretty consequential for another person.
For Marquez, yeah, very
Which,
true.
by the way, no beef between Mark and Stefan over that. Still best buds forever.
Not at all.
Yeah. No, some in the moment, certainly from Marquez's hand gestures, but I think Bradl knew what he'd done there absolutely as well.
Fellow members of the Honda Punishment Society.
Yeah, indeed. Final question. Dan Neal says, there seems to be more and more riders just laying the bike on top of riders who are going underneath them, and I've noticed more and more instances as a result. Is this defensive technique something that needs addressing? Probably the most notable of one of those was Morbidelli and Marquez, I thought, in over this weekend. But I know what Dan means.
It's part of the problem is that it's very noticeable this weekend because Sachsenring does it, especially that corner. There's multiple lines through a few corners at Sachsenring that inevitably means that riders in close competition end up merging. And I think that more than anything, it is just a Sachsenring couple of corner problem. We end up with it. There's a few other corners over the course of the season where if you run even a little bit wide, you end up in the same trajectory as someone else without being able to see them in the exit of it. The one that always comes to mind is the Jorge Lorenzo wipes out everyone moment from 2017 where he took Barcelona, where he took
you mean Barcelona 19, right? When he removed all of
he was on the Honda, wasn't he?
No, I think he means a different one. No, he means a different one.
He took Dolby, Pedrosa, and Marquez.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
So there are just moments where these things happen. And I think Sachsenring just makes it stand out.
Val agrees. So thank you everyone for all those questions from the Members Club. Thank you, Val and Simon, for joining us to kind of pick through what might have been, we say this so often, might have been the title deciding weekend. But certainly when your championship leader lobs it off the road with 2 laps to go while leading and about to put some points on his rival, it's going to be a significant one, isn't it? We've got a 4-week break in racing again now. Summer break too. And that's what Dorna commentators called the previous summer break spring break. But this is now we've moved from spring to summer already. During that time, we have an exclusive interview with the Aprilia boss, Massimo Rivola, to bring you. That'll be in the main feed, and there'll be a separate MotoGP extra for the Members Club where he has answered a load of your questions as well. Simon is off to World Superbikes and the Women's World Championship at Donington this weekend. We'll be reporting from there as well, and there'll be, again, a bit in the main feed, a bit in MotoGP extra for the Members Club. We've got a lot of things we can talk about. We've deliberately avoided the rider market in this one, so we can get to that in the next few weeks. We've got a stack of questions that we haven't answered about kind of sub-MotoGP rider market, who might be coming up from Moto2 and everything that's going on around there. A chance for Val to bang on about Firmin Aldiger, although the question is actually about Simon's opinion of Firmin Aldiger. So all that to come in the next few weeks, but for now, we're going to take a breather, take stock. Simon's going to drive across Germany. We're back in your ears, probably with Rivola, maybe with some rider market. Let's see what happens in the rider market the next few days, next week. Thanks for your time, listeners, and we'll speak to you soon.
The Athletic.